The day a fire truck got stuck at the end of a neighborhood road, people acted like I was the villain in some small-town disaster movie. Parents were complaining, delivery drivers were losing their minds, and the president of the Homeowners Association was pounding on my front door before sunrise demanding answers. The crazy part is that none of it would have happened if they hadn't decided to tow my truck off my own property. My name is Ryan Holloway, and I live on 5 acres of land my family has owned for over 30 years. Long before there was an HOA, long before there were neatly lined sidewalks and matching mailboxes, my father bought that property because he wanted space. He liked being left alone. Honestly, so do I. The land sits at the edge of a subdivision called Pine Creek Estates, a place full of nice houses, freshly trimmed lawns, and enough HOA rules to fill a phone book. I never lived inside the subdivision. I never signed any HOA agreement. I never agreed to follow their rules. We were neighbors, nothing more. Most of the residents were decent people. We'd wave to each other, talk occasionally, help each other out when needed. The problem was never the homeowners. The problem was the HOA board, especially its president, a woman named Denise Callahan. Denise was one of those people who couldn't stand seeing something outside her control. For years, she'd been sending letters to my mailbox, complaining about things she had absolutely no authority over. One letter said my workshop was visible from several homes and should be painted a more attractive color. Another suggested my equipment trailer lowered neighborhood property values. My favorite one claimed my fence didn't fit the visual character of the community. Every time one of those letters arrived, I'd laugh and throw it straight into the trash. I wasn't part of her HOA, and she knew it. Somehow that seemed to bother her even more than if I had been. My work truck became one of her favorite targets. It wasn't anything special, just an old white Ford F-250 that had seen better days. The paint was faded, the driver's seat was torn, and the air conditioning only worked when it felt generous. But it was reliable. Every evening after work, I'd pull into my property and park it on the same gravel pad beside my workshop. I've been parking there for years. Nobody ever questioned it. Then one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I'd spent the entire day repairing farm equipment under a brutal Tennessee sun. By the time I headed home, I was exhausted. My shirt was soaked through with sweat, my back hurt, and all I wanted was a cold shower and a quiet evening. As I turned into my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. The gravel pad looked empty. I slowed down, looked again. Then I stopped the truck I was driving and stared. My pickup was gone. For a few seconds, I honestly thought somebody had stolen it. I walked around the property checking places that made absolutely no sense. As if a full-size pickup truck could somehow disappear behind a tree. After 10 minutes of confusion, I called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher took my information and placed me on hold. A minute later, she came back. "Mr. Holloway, your truck wasn't stolen." I remember feeling relieved for about half a second. "Then where is it?" I asked. "It was towed." I actually laughed. "Towed? By who?" She gave me the name of a towing company located about 20 miles away. I drove there immediately. The guy behind the counter looked like he hated his job and everyone who walked through the door. He slid paperwork across the counter and said, $380. "For what?" I asked. "Tow fee. Storage fee." I paid because I needed my truck. Then I picked up the paperwork and looked at the reason for removal. Abandoned vehicle on community property. I stared at those words for several seconds. My truck wasn't abandoned, and it sure as hell wasn't on community property. It had been sitting on land my family owned before half that subdivision even existed. I asked who authorized the tow. The employee looked down at the file. Denise Callahan, HOA president. Of course it was Denise. Driving home, I expected to be furious. Instead, I found myself thinking, something didn't add up. Denise was arrogant, sure, but even she had to know where my property line was. Or maybe she didn't. The next morning, I called the HOA management company and asked for an explanation. The woman who answered sounded uncomfortable from the moment I mentioned the tow. She explained that Denise had reported the truck as an abandoned vehicle sitting on HOA property. Then she said something that changed everything. According to our subdivision records, that section belongs to the community. I sat there silently for a moment. "Can you repeat that?" I asked. She repeated it. According to their records, The land where my truck had been parked belonged to them. The towing fee suddenly stopped matching. The truck stopped matching. Because if their records actually showed my land as theirs, then somebody had made a massive mistake somewhere along the line. I could have demanded reimbursement. I could have threatened lawsuits right then and there. Instead, I thanked her for the information, hung up the phone, and walked out to an old filing cabinet my father left behind years ago. Deep down, I had a strange feeling. A feeling that this wasn't just about a truck. This was about to become something much bigger than anyone in that HOA could possibly imagine. I spent the rest of that afternoon digging through old property records that my father had kept organized in thick manila folders. He wasn't the type of man who trusted memory when paperwork existed. So every survey, every deed, every tax document dating back decades was sitting exactly where he'd left it. The more I looked through those records, the more convinced I became that something wasn't right. Every map I found showed the same basic boundary lines I'd always known. My gravel pad sat comfortably inside my property. There wasn't even a close call. Still, I didn't want assumptions. I wanted proof. Real proof. The kind that could survive a courtroom. The next morning, I drove down to the county recorder's office and pulled every document related to my parcel and the Pine Creek Estates development. The woman helping me must have seen hundreds of property disputes over the years because she raised an eyebrow when she saw how many records I was requesting. Neighbor issue? She asked with a smile. Something like that, I replied. By the end of the day, I had copies of plats, subdivision plans, historical surveys, easement documents, and enough paperwork to fill an entire box. That's when I called a licensed surveyor named Greg Wilson. Greg had been working land surveys for nearly 30 years. Around the county, his word carried weight. If Greg said a property line was in a certain place, judges tended to believe him. 3 days later, he arrived with a crew carrying tripods, GPS equipment, measuring rods, and enough gear to look like they were preparing for a moon landing. For 2 days, they worked across the backside of my property while I tried to stay busy in my workshop. Every few hours, I'd glance out the window and see them taking measurements, checking coordinates, comparing old records. I kept telling myself they were going to confirm what I already knew, and I'd simply send the HOA a bill for the towing fee. Looking back now, that was probably the last peaceful thought I had for several weeks. On the third day, Greg knocked on my workshop door. His expression was strange. Not worried exactly, but surprised. "Ryan, you need to come take a look at this." We walked out toward the property line behind my land where Pine Creek Estates connected to the subdivision road. Greg unfolded a large survey map on the hood of his truck and pointed to a section highlighted in red. "Tell me I'm reading that wrong," I said. Greg shook his head. "You're not." I stared at the map, then stared again. The subdivision's cul-de-sac, the large turnaround area at the end of their road, wasn't entirely on HOA property. About 11 feet of it sat directly on mine. Not a few inches, not a foot, 11 feet. I remember laughing because the numbers sounded ridiculous. "You've got to be kidding." Greg didn't laugh. "Developer made a mistake during construction 15 years ago. Looks like they built the turnaround based on an incorrect reference point. Nobody caught it." I looked up at the road. For 15 years, every resident in that neighborhood had used that turnaround every single day. School buses used it. Delivery trucks used it. Moving vans used it. Garbage trucks used it. Fire trucks used it. The HOA that had just towed my truck for supposedly being on their property had been occupying a chunk of my land for over a decade without even realizing it. The irony was so beautiful, it almost felt fictional. For a few days, I didn't do anything. I just sat with the information. Part of me wondered whether I should simply notify them and move on. Then I remembered the $380. I remembered Denise signing paperwork authorizing a tow from land she never bothered verifying. I remembered years of arrogant letters telling me how to manage property she didn't own. Every time I thought about letting it go, another memory surfaced. Eventually, I met with a real estate attorney named Mark Benson. I handed him the survey and watched his expression change as he studied the map. "This is bad," he said. "For them." "How bad?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. "Legally, very bad." Over the next hour, he explained exactly what the survey meant. The HOA wasn't just crossing my property occasionally. Their entire turnaround depended on using part of my land. Without that 11-foot section, the cul-de-sac would no longer function properly. Vehicles wouldn't have enough room to turn around safely. Larger vehicles might not be able to maneuver at all. What are my options? I asked. Mark smiled slightly. A lot of options. We started with the simplest approach. A formal trespass notice. The HOA received certified documentation informing them that a portion of their road system occupied private property. We included copies of the survey and requested immediate discussion regarding resolution. A week passed. No response. Another week passed. Still nothing. Finally, an email arrived from the HOA attorney. The message basically dismissed the issue and suggested additional review would be needed. In other words, they thought I was bluffing. That turned out to be a very expensive mistake. Mark looked at me during our next meeting and said, "If they don't want to discuss it, you can always enforce your property rights." I knew exactly what he meant. 2 weeks later, a contractor delivered several massive concrete bollards. If you've never seen one, imagine a reinforced concrete post designed to stop vehicles. They aren't subtle. We installed them precisely along my property line, according to the certified survey. Not 1 inch beyond it. Everything was measured twice. By sunset, the work was finished. The next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on my porch. Around 7:30, the entertainment began. The first resident drove toward the cul-de-sac, slowed down, and stopped. A second vehicle arrived behind him. Then a third. People got out of their cars, staring at the concrete barriers like they had appeared from another dimension overnight. Within an hour, confusion spread across the entire subdivision. The turnaround space they'd relied on for 15 years was suddenly gone. The road technically still existed, but now vehicles couldn't complete a normal turn. Drivers had to reverse long distances to get back out. Larger vehicles struggled immediately. Around lunchtime, an Amazon van attempted a turnaround and nearly got wedged against a curb. The driver spent 10 minutes making a 20-point turn while residents watched. The following morning, a school bus arrived and discovered it couldn't safely maneuver through the restricted space. Parents stood outside recording videos on their phones while children stared through bus windows, trying to understand why everyone seemed angry. By the third-day neighborhood, social media pages were exploding. Some residents blamed me. Others blamed the HOA. Most were simply confused. Then came the moving truck. A family near the end of the street happened to be relocating that week. Their truck entered the subdivision, reached the cul-de-sac, and discovered there wasn't enough room to turn around. The driver attempted several maneuvers before finally getting stuck sideways. Traffic backed up through nearly the entire neighborhood. For 3 hours, nobody could get through properly. I watched the whole thing from a distance while trying very hard not to smile. 24 hours later, someone began pounding on my front door hard enough to shake the glass. I opened it and found Denise standing there with 2 board members. Her face was bright red. "You need to remove those barriers immediately," she snapped. "They're creating a safety hazard." I leaned against the doorframe. "My barriers?" "Yes, your barriers. The ones on my property?" Her jaw tightened. "You're interfering with neighborhood access." I stepped inside, grabbed the certified survey, and handed it to her. Denise looked down at the document. Her confidence lasted about 10 seconds. Then she turned another page. Then another. The color slowly drained from her face. One of the board members took the survey and started reading. Neither of them said anything for nearly a minute. Finally, Denise looked up. "This can't be right." "That's what I thought when my truck got towed," I said. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since I'd known her, she simply stood there speechless. And that was the moment I realized the fight was finally about to become very real. Over the next few days, everything changed. Up until that point, Denise and the HOA board had treated the situation like an annoyance they could eventually pressure me into fixing. Once their attorney finished reviewing the survey, that attitude disappeared overnight. Mark called me late one afternoon and sounded far more amused than professional. "Well," he said, "their lawyer finally got back to me." "And?" I asked. He confirmed the encroachment is real. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the workshop window. "So they finally understand the problem." Oh, they understand it now. The HOA attorney apparently spent 2 days reviewing construction records, subdivision filings, and historical plats before reaching the same conclusion Greg had reached in less than an hour. 15 years earlier, the developer had made a surveying error during construction. The mistake was never caught, never corrected, and over time, everyone simply assumed the cul-de-sac sat where it belonged. Now 42 households were discovering that assumptions can become very expensive. A formal meeting was scheduled the following week. I showed up with Mark. The HOA showed up with their attorney, Denise, several board members, and enough paperwork to kill a small forest. The atmosphere felt less like a negotiation and more like a funeral. Their attorney got straight to the point. Mr. Holloway, we'd like to discuss purchasing the affected section of land. There it was. The sentence they never imagined they'd have to say. For years they acted like they controlled everything around them. Now they were asking permission to use my property. I almost laughed. Instead I nodded and said, "I'm listening." They asked what I wanted for the strip. Before the meeting, Mark and I had spent days calculating value, future impact, replacement costs, and leverage. We both knew rerouting the road would cost them a fortune. I looked directly at Denise before answering. $285,000. The room went silent. One board member actually choked on his coffee. Denise stared at me as if I'd asked for the moon. Their attorney remained calm, but even he looked surprised. After a long pause, he said, "That's significantly above what we anticipated. Then perhaps you should relocate the road." I replied. The first offer they made was $40,000. I honestly thought I had misheard the number. Mark didn't even bother responding. He simply closed his folder. I stood up from the table. "If that's your offer, we're done here." Denise looked stunned. "You're walking away?" "You walked away when you towed my truck," I said. Then we left. The next 3 weeks were absolute chaos inside Pine Creek Estates. Residents grew angrier every day. Backing accidents started happening because drivers were constantly reversing down the narrow street. 2 separate fender benders occurred in a single week. Delivery companies began complaining. Service vehicles struggled to access homes efficiently. Then came the incident that completely broke the HOA's resistance. During a scheduled emergency response drill, a fire truck attempted to maneuver through the compromised turnaround area and became temporarily stuck. Nobody was injured, and the truck eventually got out, but the symbolism was devastating. Residents who had previously blamed me started asking different questions. Why had the HOA authorized towing a truck without confirming property ownership? Why hadn't they verified the survey when they received the trespass notice? Why were homeowners suffering because of mistakes made by the board? Pressure mounted fast. Denise went from acting confident to looking exhausted every time she appeared in public. Eventually, the HOA attorney called Mark again. This time there was no posturing, no arguments, no lowball offers. They wanted a settlement. A real one. A week later, we sat down for the final meeting. Their attorney slid paperwork across the table and said, "The association agrees to your terms." I read every page carefully. $285,000 for the land. Reimbursement of the $380 towing fee. $12,000 covering legal expenses. Everything in writing. Everything enforceable. I signed. They signed. Just like that. The dispute that had consumed weeks of everyone's lives was over. Within days, the transfer was recorded, construction crews modified the area, and normal traffic flow returned to the neighborhood. School buses resumed their routes. Delivery vans stopped getting trapped. Residents could finally turn around without performing complicated driving maneuvers. Life went back to normal. Mostly. Every now and then I'll run into someone from Pine Creek Estates at the hardware store or the gas station. Most of them are friendly. A few even apologize for taking the HOA's side before all the facts came out. As for Denise, I've only spoken to her once since everything ended. We crossed paths several months later. She glanced at my truck sitting on the gravel pad beside my workshop and then looked away without saying a word. No complaints, no letters, no warnings, no demands, just silence. Honestly, I think that silence was worth almost as much as the money. These days I still park that same old Ford in that same exact spot every evening. The gravel pad hasn't moved. The truck hasn't changed much, but every time I shut off the engine and walk toward the house, I can't help remembering how a $380 towing bill turned into a $297,380 lesson in property rights. And here's the question I still think about sometimes. If I had simply paid the towing fee, gotten angry for a few days, and moved on, nobody would have ever discovered the mistake. The HOA would still be using that land without knowing it, and I'd never have uncovered what was sitting right under everyone's nose for 15 years. So tell me what you think. Did I go too far by installing the barriers and forcing the issue, or did the HOA create its own disaster the moment it decided to tow a truck from land it never bothered to verify? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I can promise you this one still starts arguments whenever people hear the story. And if you enjoy real-life property disputes, HOA drama, and stories where actions have consequences, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next one.